All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Kopp. I'm a professor at the University of Western Ontario, and I'm going to be leading the webinar today on the observations from the Angus tornado. If you could please mute your phones so we don't distract. We'll take questions after the seminar, and if you could hold your questions till then, that would be great. And in the meantime, please make sure your phone is on mute. I also currently have control of this, so I will also try to mute it from this end.
The conference has been muted.
All right. So Paul asked me to talk briefly today about what we saw at Angus. We were there with Environment Canada on the morning of June 18th, the day after the tornado. And what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about what we observed there. So the focus of my presentation is going to be a few things. We're going to go over what we saw in Angus, what we found there, with an emphasis on the patterns of damage and what the EF scale ratings may have been. I'm also going to compare where possible with what we observed in the Vaughan tornadoes in 2009, so 5 years ago. And there's some similarities and differences there that we're gonna talk about. And I'm also going to talk about how we might mitigate some of the severest damage that we saw in this tornado and in the Vaughan tornado. And so my talk will focus on those aspects. So the tornado on June 17th had quite a long track. It was about 20 kilometers along. It went from the town of Angus and went south of Barrie and ended up near Innisfil. There was a second tornado near the town of Stroud, which had a very short track of a few hundred meters. So this was for sure the major event that day. What I'm going to focus on is where most of the damage was to residential construction, which was in the town of Angus, and particularly in this neighborhood, which is very new construction. Most of the houses were less than 3 years old. So we were there with Environment Canada on June 18th, and we tried to find every house with damage in the town. And we found 101 houses with damage, and they're marked on this slide. So all of those pinpoints were damaged. If you look at this image from Google Maps, there's even some damage at places that appear not to have houses. So these houses were built after the satellite image was taken for the mapping. So it's a very new neighborhood, and so it gave us an opportunity to see how new construction works under this severe weather. Of interest was the bulk of the damage occurred on 2 particular streets, and it appeared that the track of the actual tornado vortex went down the backyards between the 2 streets, and so that's where a lot of the damage was that we'll focus on. And so it's really these 2 streets that provide us with interesting observations, and you can see that practically every house along those 2 streets were damaged. The other damage was outside of those 2 streets, was mostly shingle damage and siding, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is the damage that we actually observed. If you look at the photographs, and I'll show more in a minute, it always looks like chaos when you do a damage survey. It looks like there's utter destruction and everything is a mess, but when you actually start to break it down, you can find some patterns. So these are the observations that we made. So not every house had the same damage, and some of it was quite a bit different. So we have found 36 houses with damage to the soffits and eaves and fascia, so relatively minor damage that isn't causing many problems. Siding was off on 28% of them. Most of these houses had a brick facade on the front and vinyl siding around the other 3 walls, although there were some differences on the 2 streets where one row of one street had bricks on the first floor, the houses going all the way around, and then vinyl siding up on the second floor, and the other street had siding on both floors. About half the houses lost shingles. Many of them lost a huge proportion of their shingles. Roof sheathing was about 10%, Roof sheathing is a structural failure, and so that's plywood on the roof, and that also allows a lot of rainwater in when that occurs. And then we had complete roof failure, so the roof was completely removed from the walls at the same number of houses. We had 11 of those. So we had, between the roof sheathing and the complete roof failure, we had about 20% of the houses had major structural failures. We also had structural failures on the walls, and I'll talk more about those because there were some interesting aspects of that, and about 10% of the houses had structural failure of the walls. And then we had other things. The front porches and entranceways had columns holding them up. These weren't fastened in, and we had 4 of those columns just fall out. We had evidence of debris impact at about 20% of the houses. Garage doors, we had 9 that blew in, and broken windows on about a quarter of the houses. And one other interesting observation, which I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about, was there was a Uhaul truck parked in one of the driveways, which the wind managed to blow over. And so those are what we observed. And again, we had about 100 houses with damage in this neighborhood. Now, if we go in the backyard, we can see really distinct kind of behaviors. The wind seemed to be more intense on one side than the other, because what we observed was there was really significant damage, a real mess on one row of the houses, which in the upper photograph on the left-hand side you can see some roofs off and vinyl siding and a lot of debris. And on the other side of the street, so in the lower photograph now on the left, pointing the camera in the other direction, you can see the houses look pretty good, aside from their fences are all missing, but the houses themselves look pretty good. So the two sides of the street behaved quite differently, and we're going to look in depth at why that was. So here's an overview of the damage on those two streets, and we've color-coded each of the houses by what we observed there in terms of the structural performance. And so in particular, we're here looking at roof failures. So the red pins indicate houses that lost their roof. The roof is completely gone. The truss is disconnected from the walls, and the roof blew away. And so you can see that we found 11 of those, and in one particular area, we had 7 houses in a row that lost their roofs. And that happened in a couple of places. So here on the western side of the street, and then a little bit further down, the damage wasn't as bad. There was 3 houses that lost their roof, and several in a row that lost their sheathing. On the other side of the street, where there was less damage, there was only a few sheathing failures near where the other street lost their roofs, but along the rest of it, it was more the cladding damage, so siding and vinyl siding, the shingles and things like that failed. And so the damage did follow a really interesting kind of pattern. So we're going to focus on these roof failures. This is the worst damage in the storm. So when houses lose their roof, obviously they're going to be condemned. These people will have to have their houses rebuilt, and they'll be out of them for some period. So this is what it looked like from the front yard in that row where there's 7 houses in a row. You can see that they're nice houses with brick cladding, but the roofs now are gone. And this happened with 7 houses in a row. If we look across the street, we can see what these houses looked like. They had hip roofs, and across the street there was practically no damage. You can see that this one small tree is being bent over. It's been in a strong wind, and you can kind of see the direction of the wind from how the tree is bending. But other than that, the shingles look a little bit ratty in places, but there's not much damage there. So the damage path is quite narrow, and so what we wanted to do is focus on why these houses lost their roofs in particular. To do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how wind acts on houses so that you understand a little bit the aerodynamic aspect, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the structural performance as well and where we see the issues here. So here's the back of those houses, so the 7 in a row. It looks like a mess. In fact, we had one with a wall failure as well. You can see segments of the roof landing on adjacent roofs, so it's really a mess there in the back. Now, one of the things we saw in Vaughan was that internal pressures played a role, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a minute, but if you have the wind blowing perpendicular to a window, and we have a window fail or a garage door, that pressurizes the inside of the house. In this case, the wind was blowing more between the backyards, and so internal pressures don't seem to have played a role here in these failures, and so it was a bit of a mystery as to why they lost so many. If we want to think about the wind loading, what we can do is when wind blows over a house in a storm, we have the same physics basically that occurs with an airplane. So you have a low pressure on the roof, and it wants to lift the roof into the air. This is exactly what happens when an airplane is moving down the runway. So if you want to think about it another way, and especially with regard to how we fasten things together, imagine turning the house upside down, hanging weights on it, and shaking it. And when you do that, you start to think about, well, maybe nailed connections aren't that great an idea. We're going to have to think about how we actually connect things together to hold it together. So if you keep that kind of picture in your mind, you can have a pretty clear idea of what the wind is doing. If we want to look at pressures, so this is what pressures might look like acting on the roof of a house when we have wind acting on it. This is the gable roof. The colors are pressure measurements. The blue colors are uplifting forces. So when you see large blue colors, that's when we have moments of very large uplift. This is playing at about real time, so you can see that the pressures are fluctuating. You can feel this every day when you're out in the wind, and you can feel the wind buffeting you a little bit. You can also see that across the roof, the pressures change quite a lot, and they change continuously in time. And so when wind is acting, we have these kinds of patterns occurring, and they're trying to lift the roof up. The shape of the roof matters also quite a lot. If we have a hip roof instead of a gable roof, as I've illustrated here, you end up with quite a different pattern. Then on top of that, as I mentioned, when you get a window or a door broken, you can have wind rushing in. So we have these pressures acting on the roof, which want to lift the roof up. So I've shown that. And when we have an opening on the wall, on a windward wall, so a garage door breaks or a window breaks, the wind rushes in there, and that pushes up on all four. You can think of it like a balloon blowing up. And on the roof surface, again, now that wind rushing in is pushing pressure up on the roof. So those two pressures add up, and you get a large uplift on a roof. This is what makes roofs particularly vulnerable. Now, in the Vaughan storm, the wind wasn't going in this direction. It was more like coming out of your page or out of your screen. And so when we had windows broken, we didn't tend to have that kind of positive pressure entering. So this is an unusual event and quite different than in Vaughan. Vaughan, we had about the same number of roof failures, but they were definitely related to garage doors in particular failing. So this is a little bit different than what we saw in Vaughan. So as an example here, this is a house in the Maple neighborhood of Vaughan. It lost its roof, as you can see. There was a large opening. In fact, the doors blew in, and we got this internal pressure, and the roof failed. Of course, it takes a little bit more than that to happen. In this case, the roof wasn't fastened to the walls as it should have been. And in fact, showing here the connection, you can see the nails. There's 2 nails, but the code actually requires 3. So they used the correct nails in this case, but they didn't have enough of them. And so we had 2 things going wrong here. We had the front doors blowing in, which allowed the internal pressures to increase the loading on the roof. And we had incorrect connection holding the roof down. Now, this is one example. We don't know, and this is one of the problems with kind of forensic observations, but it's difficult to find all the connections afterwards. But we try to find as many as we can to see what kind of conclusions we make. Now, let's contrast this with the neighbor. This is the house right beside it. It was kind of a mirror image, so you can see that they look very, very similar. And this house had only some shingle damage. So you can see the combination of having a large opening and inadequate fasteners compared to not having that internal opening. We don't know anything about the fasteners because we didn't get into this house, but you can see the difference that the internal pressures certainly can make, as well as the strength of the fasteners. So one of the things we did in Angus was we went looking for the connections, and we found about a dozen of them. We found trusses intact. So what you typically find in these storms is large sections of the roof truss is more or less intact, and the connections here. This particular one, you can see that the lumber split at the connection, so the connection failed there. But if we also look in detail, we found many incorrect connections on the ground. Here's one that had only one nail in it. So it had again the correct nail, but there was only one of them holding it down. You can see how it bent as it pulled out. But that is certainly not up to the code level, and could be an explanation for this problem. Of all the connections that we found, we actually didn't find one that we thought was code compliant. Now, we've done quite a bit of work at this at our lab, at the Insurance Research Lab for Better Homes at Western, which we affectionately call the Three Little Pigs Project, where we've tested full-scale houses. And we've taken quite a look at these connections because every time we go and look at storm damage, we see these kind of failures have occurred. And so if this is a lab connection, you can see the three nails making up a toenail. This is a code connection after it's being pulled out. And so what we do is measure the forces that it requires to pull such a connection apart. And so we get a better sense of what kind of wind it takes to actually cause a failure. So we have, just so you understand what this is, the top of the wall is here. So at the top of the wall, there's two 2x4s that are nailed together. Then the trusses sit on top of that, and they're fastened, or should be fastened, with three nails, put it at an angle, and fastened. And so we've done quite a bit of work on the strength of these. And one of the things we've done actually is test with missing nails. And so we've tried many experiments with one nail missing and a couple nails missing. And the outcome of that is, when you start looking at the performance of houses, is that it reduces the wind speed that causes failure by about 40%. So getting these nails right is really critical. As well, we've also looked at hurricane clips. Here's a picture of a hurricane clip, again in our lab. So you see the top of the wall would be here, the truss is sitting here, and we have the metal clip. These are, I haven't bought one recently. My students told me that they picked some up a few weeks ago for 60 cents a piece. So these are not expensive. This is not expensive material. But what these do is they change the capacity quite substantially. So if we have a code-compliant toenail, these inexpensive hurricane clips roughly double the capacity, which increases the wind speed to cause failure probably by about 40%. So instead of having one toenail, if we had one of these, even incorrectly fastened, would have much higher capacity than current code fasteners. So even for Vaughan, where we thought it was a bit more severe than in Angus, we believe that these inexpensive measures would have kept the roofs on in both of these events. We're still trying to analyze from Angus what the wind speeds might have been. We haven't finished our analysis of that, but we're currently working on that. We've just been pulling things together. Now, the houses in Angus had, we don't think there was internal pressures playing a role, and they were hip roofs. And there's a big difference between hip roofs and gable roofs. This is a photograph from Barrie. So 30 years ago now, almost 29 years ago, was the Barrie tornado, which was more severe. It was rated EF4, F4 at the time. Now we would call it EF4 under the enhanced Fujita scale. But you can see the houses in the foreground lost their roofs. They also lost some walls. So this is very serious damage. In the front here, you can't know it because the roofs are gone, but these had gable roofs. The houses in the background had hip roofs, and you can see the damage is much less severe on the hip roofs. There's just shingles basically off the roof, whereas here we had full roof failure. So our analysis suggests that from a wind tunnel study, a two-story gable roof has wind loads that are about 50% higher, so they're much worse aerodynamically. The houses in Angus had hip roofs, so they should be taking advantage of that. The other advantage of hip roofs is they're better at distributing the load because of how the structure is actually put together. And they also have connections on all four walls rather than only on two that the gable roofs have. So these two factors lead to about a 40% difference in failure wind speed, all else being equal. So these are substantial differences. So we're still trying to figure out what's happened in Angus. I'm going to talk about the Fujita scale in a second with the degree of damage. But these hip roofs in Angus, we didn't find adequate connections, and we think that was the significant player in these failures. I'm going to talk a little bit about the enhanced Fujita scale, which Canada adopted last year in 2013, and in the United States it was adopted in 2006. So the Angus tornado was rated EF2. The enhanced Fujita scale is a damage scale, so it's based on the observations of damage, and from that, the enhanced Fujita scale was developed by a set of experts who estimated the wind speeds that would have caused that level of damage, and so it has not actually been scientifically verified. So a lot of what we're trying to do in our work is verify this scale. But if we take it for what it is, these are the scale ratings and the wind speeds associated with them. So Angus and Vaughan in 2009 were both rated EF2. That puts the wind speeds at between 180 and 220 kilometers per hour. Now, most of the damage that we observe typically is for houses, and so we have these different degrees of damage. You expect there's a threshold of visible damage that, because the lower bound is probably about 85 kilometers an hour, and typically around 100 kilometers an hour, 105 kilometers an hour, you start to see damage in windstorms. As you start to lose fascia and the eaves troughs and soffits and vinyl siding, the wind speed increases, and there's a range that's expected 100 to 150, 160 kilometers an hour, with an expected value around 130 kilometers an hour. As you increase the level of damage, you get broken windows and doors, and you get more and more shingles coming off. All of these are associated with higher wind speeds. And so if you lose shingles, 20% of them or so, the expected range of wind speeds is from 130 to about 190 kilometers an hour. As you get to higher levels, you can start removing the roof, and again, there's wind speeds associated with that. And as you go up to the highest speeds, everything falls off. So what we've seen is we saw several houses with the roofs off, 11 of them, and that was rated EF degree of damage 6, and so the expected wind speed range is between about 170 and 230 kilometers an hour typically. Okay, now if we look across the street, what we saw was shingle and tile. So again, here we've looked at the damage, but I've keyed the markers with different colors. So the red indicate houses that have primarily lost shingles, the siding also with it, and so we've said if there's sort of more siding, we've labeled it green. If there's more shingles, we've labeled it red. And everything else, so if they didn't lose shingles and siding, they're labeled in yellow. So before we saw those houses with the roofs off, they didn't seem to have much siding off. It's hard to say much about the shingles because the roof was gone, but they seemed to have been reasonably good in terms of what was happening along the walls. But across the street, we had a lot of shingle damage. And so if we start correlating these two things, if the wind speeds were very similar here, you can see that the effect of the nails, I think, is profound in terms of the performance. You can see that, again, we had about 50% of the houses lost substantial proportion of shingles. So here, if we look down the street from the front, you can see the repetitive patterns of shingle loss on most of the roofs. Here's one that had sheathing off, but you can see the repetitive patterns on the other street where there was not the roof failures. We also saw siding in many places. Again, there was siding everywhere, with about 30% of the houses who lost some substantial portion of siding. And so if we look at that in terms of the Fujita scale, that puts us at a degree of damage 4, and the expected wind speeds for that are in this range here, from 130 to 190 kilometers an hour. Now, one of the things that can help us assess that is this Uhaul that blew over. And so this is a completely independent measure, and it's actually something that we've done wind tunnel studies of, and we can actually relate these two together. So if we take a few things, if you notice The enhanced Fujita scale doesn't talk about vehicles at all, but in Fujita's original scale from the 1970s, it had a discussion of vehicles, and I'll show that in a second. But the other thing that we have now is that we can correlate. So we have all these shingles that have failed. We see some garage doors that have failed. We have siding off, and we can correlate that with this vehicle rolling over. So we have these repetitive shingle failures with greater than 20% of the roof uncovered, and this is all in the region around that Uhaul. And we see a whole bunch of garage doors blown in. If we look in the other direction, we see the same kind of pattern. Some sheathing off, handful of garage doors blown in, and a lot of shingles off. So on the original Fujita scale, he mentions vehicles at the F1 level. He talks about moving autos being blown off the road when the wind speeds are in the range from 120 to 880 kilometers an hour. That starts to make sense if you think about if you tried to drive your car 180 kilometers on the 401, that's not particularly safe, and a little bit of wind and a little bit of gust can make it quite dangerous. So that kind of goes with our intuition. At higher levels, he talks about cars being lifted off the road, off the ground, and thrown, and that happens at slightly higher wind speeds. At even higher F3, we have heavy cars lifted off the ground and thrown. And if we even look down here at F5, we see automobile-sized missiles flying through the air. So, for example, in the Eli tornado in 2007, near Winnipeg, there was a minivan that flew about 100 meters, and that was part of that F5 rating. So we have the vehicle, and what we have from our current study is this seems to correlate with the vehicle blowing over correlates with this degree of damage 4, where we lose a lot of the shingles and the siding, and so that seems to give an indication that this vehicle blowing over falls into the EF1 range. And we actually did studies on the wind tunnel. We had studies of a van. We had also some larger tractor trailers, but we have basically this Uhaul type of structure here, type of vehicle that we tested, and we made measurements on the speeds to blow it off. And it of course is a variable process. So one of the things one has to realize about these storms is that everything is kind of variable. So we try to estimate the bounds, but we find that at the lower bound, the wind speed causing failure would be around 44 meters per second. That's about 140 kilometers an hour, up to over 50, which is getting closer to 200 kilometers an hour. And so that's kind of the range of wind speed where it takes to blow a U-Haul type of van over, and that's measured in the wind tunnel. But it seems remarkably consistent with this degree of damage 4. So this independent rating, the correlation is very clear from the damage observations, but actually it seems remarkably consistent with our measurements. So we're really happy with this kind of range. I think maybe we've been a little bit lucky because there is quite a few uncertainties, but there's a remarkably good agreement between the van blowing over and the local shingle damage, which gives also gain more confidence in the wind tunnel method for this. One of the last things I want to talk about this morning is the windborne debris. Windborne debris is a really significant issue in storms, and is something that I think we have to think about how to deal with. This image was from Goderich, which was a more severe tornado rated F3 for 3 years ago. And you can see this vehicle, the structural material from roofs. So these are roof trusses, 2x4s, which have flown through the air and penetrate everything. You can see the severity of the Goderich in the background with the trees and everything broken, and there was a lot of bricks. Here's a vehicle over on the right-hand side that's being overturned. So this was a very severe tornado. Windborne debris is significant because often deaths are associated with debris impacts. That's why you don't want to stand near windows during a tornado because basically anything flying through the air is going to go through that window. We saw the same kind of thing in Angus. So again, here's some 2x4s which have gone through walls. You can also see the walls are a mess. All the windows are broken, and they're sliding off. But all this structural material when one roof fails, it flies and hits adjacent structures. And this is, again, one of those significant issues. Here again, this house is a mess. It has lost a substantial portion of its roof sheathing, as you can see above, but you can see the locations of the debris impacts here, the broken windows, and we've had some very serious impact on the walls from debris. In this case, they didn't stick into the wall as in the previous photo, but you can see the effect is just as real. So this is one of the significant effects. When we have, again, I want to emphasize this point, if we have debris breaking windows and doors, this causes internal pressures. Typically, this was from Vaughan in 2009. In this case, the garage door failed. The roof lifted off. Where did that roof go? Well, it flew and it landed right here on the neighbor's house. So this house looks like it was absolutely devastated, like it was in a war zone. In a sense it was, because it was hit by a missile. The missile was the neighbor's garage roof. And so when that happens, that causes quite a significant destruction. So one house loses its roof, and then a second one can also lose its roof, and you get this cascading kind of effect. We saw this very clearly in Vaughan. This has been documented in severe hurricanes and in tornadoes. This is a well-known phenomenon. We saw the same thing in Angus. This house lost its roof. Where did it go? Well, it flew through the air because the wind speed's pretty high, and it hit a neighboring house. And in fact, large portions of it landed on this adjacent house's roof and also impacted it. So you can see the mess that this leaves. So when we're unable to keep the roofs onto the walls, we have serious problems with downwind houses also being impacted. You can see the influence here. These houses have been hit by this roof. The houses on the right of the photo did really well, right? And this is on that street where there was only really shingle and siding loss, and you can see the difference that the debris impact makes. So we're still in the midst of analyzing the debris impact. And so my students have put this together. We still need to talk a little bit about how they've assembled this, but the red pinpoints are houses that have had significant debris impacts. The yellow ones are ones that didn't. That house that I just showed here is in this region right here due to the roof failures just across the way over here. And so what we see is along the row of the street where we only had shingle and siding failures, there's almost no debris impacts. The storm was traveling from left to right in this image, and basically I think the core of the vortex was traveling between the two rows of houses, and so the wind speeds are going to be substantially, mostly from the left to right. This is a very fast-moving storm. The front was moving at about 80 kilometers an hour. We're still trying to get a precise number on that from the radar, working with Environment Canada. But it looks like the debris on the one side was impacting in the direction of the wind quite substantially. And so where we had roof failures, we seem to have a very high correlation with the structural damage. If we put the two maps together, so the upper one now is just the debris impact map, and the one below is the roof structural failure map. You can see that there's a very strong relationship between the structural failures and the debris impact results. And so this is again something that we think needs to be dealt with. If we use hurricane clips on the roof, we keep most of that structural material attached to the house. The shingles will go, but the overall damage, the overall outcome will be much reduced. And so even the weak houses, if we can hold those together, they'll be better. And then the ones that already were strong enough but got hit by the neighbor's house, by the neighbor's roof, those will also be protected. So we kind of get more bang for the buck with that. The last thing I want to talk about, there was quite a lot of discussion I saw in the media about these wall failures because they look spectacular. Here's a house where the wall failed, and you can look in on the bedroom. You can even see his pillows still attached to the bed. The roof obviously lost some shingles, so it's been under some significant wind. But this is kind of an uncharacteristic failure. The normal sequence is for the roof to fail first and then the walls to come afterwards. For a wall to be pulled out of that structure, if it was well built, there would be a lot more structural damage. So what it suggests always is that there's some inadequacy in the construction technique when you see this kind of failure. I can give another example of that. In this particular house, it was just beginning to lose its walls. And so you can see that the walls on the second floor here have started to move out. I'll put a red line there so you can see it. But that wall is starting to come out. And if you take a close-up look at it, you can see here, in fact, you start looking underneath, and we didn't find a single nail connecting this wall to the floor below. And so it's perhaps a little bit unsurprising that the wall would come out under this kind of storm. But this isn't completely inadequate in my opinion. And so I'm going to wrap up there. Glenn McGilvery at ICLR reminded me of this rhyme, and I actually looked it up in Wikipedia. It originated in the 14th century, but I think it summarizes the takeaway message I would like you to have is, for want of a nail, the shoe was lost, and if you go through it, you end up losing everything. So it's the small details here that are really, really critical. I don't think most people think very much about the nails that are going into their house. They've probably never looked, but the details here play a big role. I think a lot of the major structural damage that we saw in Angus could have been stopped. Certainly, if there had been adequate toe nailing, we would have seen much reduced damage. And if we'd used hurricane clips, I'm absolutely certain that we wouldn't have lost roofs there, and so we wouldn't have had those condemned houses, and all these families would have been able to stay in their home while they were getting new shingles and new siding put on. And so I'm going to stop there. I need to acknowledge a few people. I'd like to thank the ICLR, who has been absolutely fantastic partner to work with, providing funding and support and encouragement for our work. NSERC also provided funding for this. We couldn't do this research without Environment Canada, and David Sills, Peter Kimball, and Mitch Meredith were very helpful with this particular storm. But we've been working with them. We couldn't get past the police line to look at this damage if we weren't with Environment Canada, so we're grateful to work with them. And of course, I couldn't present this work without my students who joined me with this, who did some of the wind tunnel testing, and they're a fantastic group to work with. So I'll stop there, and if anyone has questions, I'll be happy to take them at this point.
The conference has been unmuted.
So, can you tell us what the next step would be to see that this kind of either inadequate standards or inadequate practices are avoided, and so that we can anticipate when the next tornado arises, you will have a happier, reduced amount of damage?
Well, that's a good question. Getting codes changed is not an easy thing to do. You need to make the economic case for it. So our observations from these storms actually help us to make that case, because we can start to get better statistics on performance. So we're trying to make, and we actually currently have before the National Building Code, we have recommendations for these changes, which came about which we submitted after our observations from Vaughan. And I think the Angus event now supports that. The other important aspect is inspection, and it's well known also from the U.S., going back all the way to Hurricane Andrew, that inspection practice plays a big role in performance. I think we have a much better inspection regime in Canada than in lots of places in the United States that I've seen. We don't typically see the same kind of failures in Canada that we do in the U.S. We have a very good code. I think the energy aspects of it in Ontario are very advanced and leads to, I think, quality construction. What I see is really a lack of understanding of wind effects in the code and in the inspection practices. I doubt very much that those roof connections were inspected. If they were, they didn't do a good job, because we found on the ground, we didn't find one code compliant one, but we found a lot of non-compliant ones. So I think work needs to be done there. I think if one goes to hurricane clips, inspection becomes easier, because you can even see that they're there or they're not there. So immediately, I think you have an easier inspection regime if you go to hurricane clips. What will happen with the next storm you asked about? Well, most houses already exist, so they're built to the code that they were built to. Retrofitting houses to capture this, to put in hurricane straps, is quite expensive because it's all behind the drywall. So you have to get in there, and it takes well, you're taking out drywall, so immediately it's going to be much more expensive. But if we do it with new construction, it's really quite inexpensive. At most, a couple $100 a house for hurricane straps. And I haven't talked much today about sheathing nails, but also changing the roof sheathing nails is probably about $20 a house. So I think all in, if we made these changes, I think it would actually be under $100 a house, and we'd have a much more resilient building stock.
As a lay person, that's to be a very small amount to outlay for the benefit of the protection. And the question then becomes, where can the political pressure be applied with the greatest effect? That may not be the type of question you want to answer, but it's the question that raises itself.
Well, to me, it's a question. I've been working on this for quite a while, and it's the question I keep coming back to. I think the builders are going to build to the code, and so I don't really blame them for any of this. And I think they're trying to build for as low cost as they can, but to meet the code, which is fair enough. I think the pressure has to come from the consumers. And I'm not sure. I mean, the people in Angus now, I'm sure, would be wanting this now in retrospect. I think Canadians expect their houses to perform pretty well, and so as a society, we have to choose the level of risk we're willing to tolerate. And for the cost here, I think the benefit makes a lot of sense. But I think people have to. Communicate with the codes and with government, with their MPs and MPPs, and try to get these things changed. We're certainly trying to advocate for it, but to date we've had, I'd say, limited success to get these things into the code.
Hi, Greg. Quick question regarding these buildings in this area. So I think I missed the beginning, but these homes are roughly 2 to 3 years old, and in this particular area, is code compliance mandatory, or is there anything to suggest that maybe there is no requirement for these builders to build to code, and then thus they didn't do it?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely certain of the answer. I would have presumed that. This is not. It's not a rural area. I mean, it's a built-up suburb, so. I guess it could go either way. I would have thought that they would have to go build to the Ontario Building Code, but it's possible that they don't. I think it's wrong if they don't, because it's certainly a suburban neighborhood. These aren't farm houses where one might have a different point of view, but I don't know exactly. Any other questions?
Do you know if metal roofs perform better than the shingle roofs?
If I was putting a new roof on my house, I'd put a metal roof on. They have to be properly fastened, but they're gonna be much better. You're not gonna have the loss of shingles. You're gonna be more watertight, and they last quite a bit longer. In lots of places in the world, they're much more common. I know in Australia, they don't put shingles on. Everyone has metal roofs, and they just last a lot longer. So you're going to be better off from wind resistance and also from cost over the lifetime.
Hi, Greg. I just had a quick question. I think in the beginning you said that you didn't have an opportunity to see any of the installed structures that were still intact.
Yeah.
Can you confirm that?
I did not. I did not get inside any houses. We did everything we were on the properties, but not inside any structure. Many of the structures were condemned, so we couldn't go up. And the other ones we wouldn't have gone into anyways the police were controlling at that point, but we would not have gone inside any structure.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
This is Glenn McGovern from ICLR.
Hi, Glenn.
Just as we were discussing here, I just got an email from a new home builder in Alberta, and he estimates that he actually put hurricane clips in a new build, and he estimates the total cost at $135. That was,
there you go.
That was 50 to 70 ties, 2 hours of labor, $10 for screws, total $135.
Yeah, and I think if it became routine, that 2 hours would probably drop. Yeah, that's a good number to have. And if we look at increased sheathing nails, that's about $20. So with that, let's say $150 per house. I don't know what the insured losses on these houses that lost their roofs, but I imagine it's quite high, and we'd be paying for if we put this in every house in the tornado regions in Ontario. I'm sure the economic balance works in our favor.
Question for ICLR. Will you be putting this webcast on your website for access so that for those that missed it, they can see later?
Yeah, it's Paul Kovacs, ICLR. We do put all these on our website as soon as we can after the event, so it'll be there for download for anybody who wasn't able to sit in for the whole thing.
Just another question related to Environment Canada, and I wasn't sure whether this is something anybody can comment on. Are we any closer to determining Ontario has a tornado alley situation happening?
Ontario is part of the tornado alley. It's sort of the tail end of it, which comes up through Michigan. Ontario has about 12 tornadoes a year on average. It's hard to get enough statistical data to draw an alley to it because there's enough variation and not enough years of data to show it very clearly. But there are definitely areas where there are more thunderstorms than others. Probably should be getting a meteorologist to talk about that, but I think there are areas that are more severely hit and areas that are less severely hit.
Greg, it's Paul Kovacs. If I can just add on your comment there. So David Sills gave a webinar recently to talk to that specific question. So Environment Canada has provided the building code officials with a map of the zones in Canada where there is a risk of a magnitude 2 or stronger tornado, like the tornadoes we've been discussing today. So that's now officially part of the National Building Code, that the map identifying the areas across Canada, including the areas in Ontario where a tornado could happen, has been specifically identified by the Government of Canada through Environment Canada into the National Building Code. So the zones in Ontario are now identified, and the zones in Western Canada too.
Anything else, anyone?
Greg, had the roofs in Angus not been hit, would you foresee far worse damage?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand that.
Well, virtually every roof in Angus was a hip roof. If they weren't hip roofs, would do you foresee worse damage, or?
It's possible. It depends how the roofs would be aligned. What happens in these neighborhoods with closely spaced houses, like they were here, many of them were side by sides as well. If they'd been gable and the ridge was all parallel, I would have thought they would have been worse. The fact that they were hip between each of the side by sides probably mitigated the load a little bit. You can, in neighborhoods, even with closely spaced houses, you can get amplification of loads along ridge lines when the roofs are closely spaced. It becomes like one long roof.
Greg, it's Paul Kovacs. I think I'm going to move us to close today.
Okay.
On behalf of everybody on the line, we have a very large number that tuned in. Greg, thank you for the important work you're doing, and thank you for making the time to present that and share this in such a timely way. So thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you, Paul.